Welcome to the Mind Chimp podcast. Rory, welcome to the Mind Chimp podcast. How are we doing?
Pretty well, I think. Yeah, it's the end of the day. It's about 7 o'clock, so I'm off caffeine at the moment, which makes things a bit more difficult. But other than that, pretty good. Yeah.
Awesome. It is awesome to have you on the show as well. I've been looking forward to this one. I've been looking forward to it. I'm not going to lie. But I know there's lots and lots of goodness what you can share with my listeners, and I have some pretty good questions. So I suppose let's get into it.
Okay.
But maybe for some of my listeners who maybe haven't come across you, if I was to ask you to summarize yourself in one sentence, what would you say?
In one sentence, I think generally benign mischief maker is probably about as close as it gets. I'm fundamentally addicted to making mischief, challenging assumptions as far as I can. But generally, I try not to do it in an angry way. And I try as far as is possible for the consequences of those things to be socially benign. In as far as you can judge in advance, of course.
Nice. Benign mischief maker. I like it. I guess for me, when I think about Rory, I think about there's lots of stuff going on for me when I think about you, Rory. I think about creativity. I think about connections. I think about a lot of things, and I want to really get into these in just a sec. But before we do, I want you to pick a number between 1 and 12, and this number will have a question, which we'll come back to a little bit later on. So yeah, feel free.
12.
Pick a number. 12.
That's because everybody else chooses 7, so I'm going to choose 12.
Very true. Okay, so I'll ask you a question now, and we will come back to it in a little bit later on. So the question you picked was, if you were braver, what would you be doing with your life? Okay, so we'll come back to it in a bit.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Cool, awesome. Okay, so I guess, Robert, when I think about you, I kind of think about, like I say, that kind of curious, creative, this expansiveness, and I guess when I think about what the stuff that you share at Nudgestock and the TED and stuff like that, I just kind of want to know, where does that come from? Where does that creativity kind of come from you, and that kind of seeing the unseen, I guess?
Interestingly, I think actually it came from practice, which is simply that what's unusual about advertising agencies, and I was in a direct marketing agency, which was effectively writing direct response advertising for about 15 years, is that it's unusual and significant, not only because of what it does, which is reasonably important, by the way, but on account of the effective environment it creates, which is almost at its best encouraging, promoting, and nurturing people who you might describe anywhere else in any other industry as an unsafe pair of hands. At its best, as David Ogilvy said, employ people your clients wouldn't. Okay, there's a complementarity there because it's an unusual environment in that effectively, if you are given a problem to solve in nearly all business environments, particularly now, the more logical, the more obvious solution naturally holds the greatest appeal, and your best career interests are served by being obviously logical. Okay, you take the problem as it is written, you solve it as it's expected to be solved, you turn it into a kind of optimization problem, and you come up with what is demonstrably a right answer, and everything is good, and you keep your job. Okay. And what's unusual in advertising agency culture, particularly, obviously there are areas like music, probably areas like architecture, actually, I suppose. But there are areas like music, which are obviously highly creative. But this is a corporate environment which is nevertheless dedicated to essentially the pursuit of the non-obvious, the counterintuitive, the perverse. And the process by which it does that is much closer, I would argue, to something like police detective work, an investigation, if you like, than it is to the usual process of thinking forwards, which is kind of inductive. It's much more essentially waiting for a lead, picking up, having a nose for a good lead, hearing an anecdote about something or someone which might have some significance, and keeping your antennae out. It's much closer to that. It's much closer to sort of true life crime detection or indeed detective fiction than it is to either conventional science, which tends to be sequential and logical, or indeed conventional business decision making. So obviously I was that way inclined, which is why I applied to an advertising agency in the first place, I suppose. But that's the great difference. There's also the great difference, which I always use to sell advertising as a career, which is it's one of those fields where if you're an actuary or if you're an accountant or if you're a lawyer, most of what you do in everyday life doesn't make you a better lawyer or a better accountant or a better actuary. Okay. But advertising is one of those fields where sitting in a cafe for half an hour, going to see a film, listening to an album track, reading a book, all of those things can actually make you better at your job and more valuable at your job. So it is a pretty interesting career path for someone who's naturally a bit of an amateur polymath. David Ogilvy, who founded Ogilvy, effectively said that a good copywriter, the hallmark of a good copywriter is that he or she is an extensive browser in all kinds of fields. And so you tend to find yourself working with people with very, very broad interests. So those are the two features, I think. But it is really important, which is that most people in a corporate setting have a love of the obvious and a fear of the oblique. And we're the opposite. If you come up and effectively say, buy this product because it's good, without adding anything, without any component of the unexpected or the unusual or the surprising, if there isn't a WTF in your work, most employers are really delighted to employ people who never create a WTF, but we're the opposite. That's actually a mark of failure. And so it's interesting. And I suppose, got quite good at this by doing my 10,000 hours of kind of hammering out advertising work. I don't know how much I believe that 10,000 hours theory, by the way, but doing a lot of something and then having a kind of nerdish interest in what you're doing. Those two things in combination really, really help. But the only two things I always advance as good practice, other than wide reading in all kinds of fields, would be cryptic crosswords and detective and either real life or fictional detective work. Strike me as interesting kind of analogues for what it is we have to do. We've got to think, in the words of Conan Doyle, we've got to reason backwards, not reason forwards. Most people go, here is the data. What does it imply for what happens next? How can we project it forwards? We have to do the opposite, which is this is the desired outcome. What would have to be true in order for that to happen? Just as a detective doesn't go, oh, look, there's a dead body. What happens next? I expect it decomposes or someone takes it to the morgue. Instead, they've got to go, what would the prior conditions have to have been in order to arrive at this corpse? And so it's a different mental mode. And actually, in I think it's The Sign of Four, possibly A Study in Scarlet, Sherlock Holmes, obviously, and effectively Conan Doyle, makes this point that that for every, that there are 1,000 people who can reason forwards for every one who reasons backwards. It's not especially difficult to do, by the way. I don't think you have to be a genius. I don't think you have to, but it's effectively a kind of learned skill, a bit like riding a bike, I think. And once you've acquired it, by the way, it doesn't really go away. You can't, to an extent, it's slightly annoying, both to you and the people around you, because you become kind of almost willfully perverse.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. It kind of there's something there around kind of once a genie's out the box, right?
Yeah.
And it's I find it really interesting. And you talked about this the last but there's something around we want these people, we want these progressive thinkers, and I find myself, in my whole career, I found myself being this and dealing with the frustrations and tensions of it. We want a disruptive thinker. We want someone who's provocative, who connects patterns and stuff like that. And I'm like, great, great, great. And then they bring me into a system which then basically turns around and goes, but only if you conform. Only if you conform to how the norms are here.
Yeah, there's a kind of tribalism to all disciplines.
Yeah.
A great book I recommend to all your listeners is actually The Silo Effect by Gillian Tett, who makes this point that effectively, within particular specialist groups, a kind of, well, tribal language, but a tribal identity builds up. And essentially, you're not supposed to question the taboos and norms of that particular tribe. And as a result, you become peculiarly hostile to ideas from outside, ideas that don't necessarily derive from your sacred methodology, because you almost see them as cheating. And I remember this extraordinary thing, which really fascinated me. And it is a worthwhile question. Why is it that creative people are generally annoying? And it's worth asking that question, because
Yeah.
I try as hard as I can not to be socially annoying, and to couch suggestions in fairly moderate terms. But one of the things that's fascinating is, if you solve a problem, it almost goes back to that Harrison and his clock. You may remember the Longitude Prize, which is, there was a prize for anybody who could find a way to calculate the longitude of ships. And obviously they knew about latitude because you used a sextant. That had been cracked a long, long time ago, probably in the Middle East. But actually longitude, how far west you were, without accurate clocks, still basically defeated them. And the whole idea, they refused to pay Harrison the prize, even though he met the criteria. Actually, he more than met the criteria. He massively exceeded them, okay? And they refused to give him the prize because they'd assumed when they contrived the prize that the solution had to be astronomical, not mechanical. And astronomy had a higher status in their own minds than clockmaking did. Harrison himself, I think, was self-taught. I'm not sure he wasn't a cabinet maker originally, and it just turned out that he was a brilliant clockmaker. And when he produced those extraordinary chronometers, which could keep accurate time on a rolling ship, i.e., without a conventional pendulum, instead of going, "Oh, that's brilliant, you've solved the problem, well done, brilliant stuff," effectively they did everything they could to resist paying him. And there's an idea, okay, I always make this point, that in a creative problem solving exercise, the answer asks the question to some degree. By which I mean is, you get to the answer before you entirely have formulated the question. Okay, this is what I mean by something that works backwards. And of course, in most of our life, that's considered cheating. Because if you said to me, what year was the French Revolution? And I said, I'm going to say 1066 because I've decided to make this question all about the Norman conquest. Okay. You go, obviously, this is bullshit. You can't just do that. Okay. That's cheating. Okay. But if you actually come up with an answer, a brilliant answer to a different question, or a brilliant answer to not only the question, but other things as well as the question, we tend to regard that as if it's kind of wrong. And as if it's cheating. Now, in that case, it isn't cheating. Okay, there's nothing wrong with post-rationalization. If you come up with a solution and then you understand why it works in reverse or in retrospect, there's nothing wrong with it. If it solves the problem, it's fine. But adherence to the process seems to carry more weight and garner more trust than actually solving the goddamn problem. And you see this in things like politics, okay? It's not that important whether politicians solve problems or not. What is important is to the extent to which they follow their own approved ideology in arriving at the solution. And so the example I give is, okay, very simple example. You might have a high school maths question which says, how many liters of gas containing so much calorific value would it take to boil water at 0 degrees centigrade in a can containing 1 liter of water? Okay. And there's a single right answer to that question, and all the information you need to solve the problem is in the question. Now, most real world situations, all the information you need to solve the problem is not in the question. Okay, there are a load of known unknowns, unknown unknowns. There are a load of things which aren't quantifiable, which you have to factor in. Okay, but in maths questions, all the information is provided. There's a single right answer, and there might be 3 or 4 different ways of solving the problem, but basically they'll all arrive at this single right answer. Now, a more interesting and a more typical question would be: you have so much gas, you have so much water. Okay, and the gas is insufficient to boil the water. How would you actually boil away the water in that container? Okay.
Okay.
Now, the answer to that question is you take it up to high altitude where the boiling point of water is considerably lower, and therefore you would have enough energy to boil water probably at 3,000 meters, okay, or top of Everest or whatever it is, or space, okay, right? That's why, by the way, tea doesn't taste very good if you're on an Everest expedition because you can't get the water to boil. And what that is
Ah.
bringing in another variable that no one's actually thought about or which has been taken as a given and saying this problem is insolvable if you make assumptions. But if you abandon one of those assumptions, which is that the water has to be boiled in your kitchen, and instead you say, well, we actually have a portable stove, actually that problem becomes solvable simply through the removal of what is an assumed constraint. And far more maths questions should be of the second kind than of the first kind. In other words, what would
Mm.
you do to solve this rather than is this possible? Because they're looking, okay, the first question, they're looking for a definitive answer, which doesn't really allow for any creativity at all. It's simple proof of kind of mental obedience, really. But in the second question, someone's actually got to think, well, what would have to change? Okay. And I think that's very interesting. That's the kind of thing where, a creative person will reason backwards and go, what are we assuming here that actually either was never true in the first place? It's just become enshrined in the assumptions we make, or else it's no longer true because culture, fashion, and tastes have changed, or possibly it's no longer true because technology has meant that what was once a engineering problem might be solved through technology and psychology. The Uber map is the example I always give, but I mean, I've got plenty of others. But the Uber map is an example where you don't reduce the wait for the taxi, but you improve the quality of time spent waiting. So you reduce the perceived wait in a sense because you're not in a state of frustration or anxiety while you're waiting for the cab to arrive. You're looking at a screen and going, oh, look, it's over there. Okay. Now, you
Yeah.
couldn't have done, in fairness, you couldn't have done that in 1950. Okay. Well, I suppose you could have phoned the home of the person who'd booked the cab every 3 minutes with an update of where the taxi now was, but that would be stupid. Okay. You could have done it with a text message, actually. You could have done, your car is now 15 minutes away, your car is now 10 minutes away. That would have been, an acceptable interim solution. But in the end, it was two very simple things, which was mapping and GPS, which basically solved a problem that hadn't been solvable through technology, at least, 20 or 30 years before. And so, we get trapped in our kind of algorithmic ritualistic behaviors, but because the world around us changes, we have to continually reassess our answers. The answer to a question in physics is the same now as it was 10 years ago and the same as it was a century ago. Okay, the right
Mm.
answer hasn't changed because the laws of nature haven't changed. But if you're solving a problem involving human behavior, the context is changing all the time. And people respond according to the context in which they find themselves. So a stimulus that might have been a brilliant stimulus to persuade someone to do something in 1890 would likewise completely fail today.
Mm. Yeah. It's interesting. I use the analogy of I use Disney quite a lot
Mm,
because I get put in a queue, right? But people look at the queue and go, "How can we remove a queue?" And Disney go, "Actually, how can we make the queue part of the experience?"
yes.
And I love that as a kind of, "Oh, we're just
I
amplifying."
said the brief for High Speed 2 shouldn't have been about capacity and speed and journey time. Those should have been secondary sense checks. Okay. Can we afford enough trains? The first question should have been, which is what Disney would have asked, by the way. If Disney had done High Speed 2, they would have said, how can we make a train journey so enjoyable that people feel stupid taking the car?
Yeah,
Okay, that
nice.
would have been a Disney question. But an engineering question immediately starts with quantifiable metrics like speed and duration, which don't really correlate to consumer behavior that much. In fact, I was thinking about this the other day. There's a train I take home sometimes if I'm in London late, which is the 11:35 from Cannon Street to Maidstone East, and I get off at Otford. And one of the reasons I particularly like that train is for weird reasons of train dynamics. Okay. The
Okay.
train's in the station for about half an hour before it leaves. So I just pitch up at sort of 10 past 11 in Cannon Street and I go and sit down on the train. And then 25 minutes later, it starts moving. But I'm already perfectly happy because I'm sitting there, I've got a table and I'm getting on with shit, And so, actually, the question to ask wasn't how you make the journey shorter, it was how do you make the journey more valuable. Now,
Mm.
engineers are really, really uncomfortable with asking psychological questions because they don't have the metrics and they can't do their mathematical QED. But okay. One great way to have a creative idea is to have a kind of Python-esque sense of the absurd. Okay, and think if you had a budget of £100 million, what else you could have done with a railway other than make it fast? Okay, well, okay. One suggestion would be you build a not very fast railway which stops at quite a lot of intermediate places, but you either buy up or create replicas of all the world's great trains, okay? Like the Union Pacific Big Boy, the Flying Scotsman, the Mallard,
Uh,
that bloody train they use on the Harry Potter films, right? And you make it into a steam railway. Now, okay, it's not going to be very fast, okay, I grant that. The capacity won't be quite as high. Well, actually, steam trains can pull a hell of a lot of carriages, so the Union Pacific Big Boy wouldn't struggle with with a 20 carriage train. Okay. Now, the only thing there is that practically every tourist to London, okay, would actually take a trip to Manchester. Okay.
mm.
Now, they may not even have wanted to go to Manchester in the first place, but the train was the destination. Now, a parallel to that is Cunard. So Cunard, for years, Cunard, the United States, the Normandy, the Italian liners, all competed for the blue ribbon, who could be the fastest across the Atlantic. And it was this amazing thing, which kind of was a competitive discriminator in liners crossing the Atlantic, because a blue ribbon liner would attract more and wealthier passengers and so on, in terms of time saving. And then the jet plane came along, and the blue ribbon became something of purely academic interest. Okay,
Yeah.
because if you could get there in a day by plane, why would you go there in 5 days by ship? And so Cunard effectively had to practice this rethinking exercise. And what they did is they said, well, the ship now needs to be thought of as a destination, not a mode of transportation. And this is, in fact, probably it has to be the best part of your holiday is actually getting there. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, in the process of doing that, the idea that actually you might get on a ship, not necessarily to go to a destination, but for the experience of being in a ship, they half created the world's cruise ship industry, really. Because if you think about it, cruise ships are not really a form of transportation because you end up where you
No.
started. Okay. Okay, you do get off and have a coach trip around Angkor Wat or whatever, but I mean it's not I mean the point is that the boat is as much the destination as the destination is, and you could have done that. Now I'm not suggesting you do that steam train thing, although there will be steam train enthusiasts who will argue that it's a much better use of what would have been probably 15 billion rather than 110. Okay, but a Python-esque sense of the absurd often gets you to a place and then you rock it back. Okay. It's much, much easier going from ridiculous to interesting than it is going from boring to interesting. And so one
Mm.
of the things that helps in this kind of mode of thinking is to start in a crazy place and then rein it back.
Yes. I love that. It kind of
So
gets me
that's
thinking
another
when.
reason we're annoying. So we're silly. We don't have a sense of proportion. And the reason we don't have a sense of proportion is that human perception doesn't really have a sense of proportion. If something's interesting, we pay attention to it, regardless of its actual importance, okay,
Yeah.
in the scheme of things. And we're also procrastinators because if you look at any creative person, John Cleese has written extensively on this in his book, Creativity, A Short but Friendly Guide, where he makes the point that a hallmark and a characteristic of people who tend to be imaginative is they leave a long gap before they commit. Okay. So they stay in a state of vague uncertainty for a surprisingly long time before they get started. Now, to people who think that work is all about getting started really quickly and getting to the end as quickly as possible, that's a maddening characteristic. Okay. It looks like kind of dilettantism. But in fact, what you're doing is you're waiting to get lucky. You're waiting for a inspiration, you're waiting for an insight, you're waiting for a surprising piece of information, you're waiting just to make a random connection with something else you noticed while you're getting on with your life. But effectively,
Mm.
you know that you shouldn't get started on a creative project until you've had a kind of aha moment. And you can't force that. And so what's maddening about creative people is, if you've managed a group of actuaries and you saw a bunch of people staring out of the window all afternoon, you'd be furious, okay? But I remember when I went for a graduate interview at J. Walter Thompson, as then was, back in 1988, I think it was, very early 1988. I remember the creative director giving us a talk and saying, mine is an unusual job because it's the only job where I look down the office and if everybody's staring out of the window, I feel satisfied. Okay? Because that is effectively anybody who's tried to do something new or different knows that it takes as long as it takes. But also the wait or the search, which appears unproductive to people who are much more reductionist, okay, that search is actually part of the production process.
Yeah. I actually think that's my favorite part of that. You know, when I look at the delivery of something, I'm like, okay, yeah, it's delivered. I actually enjoy the wonderment and the deep thinking and the kind of the whimsical, I
Mm.
guess, and the fleeting and hoping that it will recircle one point or another. Um, but I
It's
kind of
very
want to get you thinking
dangerous
on a couple.
because it's a very fragile existence in modern business, because modern businesses are more and more run by functions like finance and procurement
Mm,
who don't really understand that. And they say, how long does it take to make a TV ad? They'll say. And you go, well, it kind of could take an afternoon. It could take a year. I mean, it's kind of, we can't really answer that question for all problems, because you only know that, the nature and length of time required to some extent when you've actually started work on the problem.
yeah. It's fascinating though, right? Because I guess when I look at a problem, a lot of the time I'm like, right, well, who has this problem? Who's the extreme worlds of who has this problem? And I was designing something for leadership. And I was like, right, we're going to go and interview people who do these adult sex parties. We're going to interview people at AA meetings,
Yeah.
and let's see how they deal with this challenge. I mean, that'll give us some form of stim. And I
Do you
remember I was
have
telling this
leadership in
story.
a sex party? I'd always assumed they were slightly anarchic.
You have a private language. That's one thing for sure.
Well, you presumably have
Um,
the safe word.
you have a safe word, but it's
Mine,
little
by the way, is
nuances. So
ow. Okay. I'm not into that sort of masochism at all. You have a safe word. And what I can never understand, I've never been to one, but they must start like a suburban drinks party. And how on earth
yeah.
does it kind of morph into an orgy? I can understand the orgy and I can
Yeah.
understand the suburban drinks party. What I can't understand is how you get from one to the other without it feeling
Well,
ridiculous.
well, this was why I went to it. This was why I
Okay, go
interviewed
on.
people from it because I was kind of saying, how does that go from one to three? Like, what does like two look like? And basically, what I was saying was, there's a big signaling and peacocking what happens, which is like an unofficial language. So, like for example, a pineapple upside down indicates that you're a swinger, and there's little nuances what isn't
Well, hold on,
discussed
that's not a
to
very
signal.
convenient signal, is it? I mean, I can't walk around the place with a fucking upside down pineapple. Where do I get the pineapple from? I mean, this
Yeah,
is
just walk around with it.
ridiculous. I mean, this is
Yeah.
bonkers.
So like
I mean, it's weird.
you'll
It's
see like
weird, isn't it? In that you really need a kind of suburban vibe. I think. I don't think
yeah.
I don't know quite why it wouldn't work in a tower block. You need to have the kind of pampas grass shit going on, don't you? I guess.
Yeah,
Um,
100%.
yeah, and so you have a pineapple. So okay, I've got to hear more about this. So
Yeah.
you somehow procure a pineapple or steal one of your host's pineapples, right? Okay.
Yeah, so basically when I say pineapple, they have like, a lot of them have like, jewelry on, and it'll
Oh,
have
I
like a
see.
little thing upside down, yeah. So it'd be signals like
Oh,
this,
right.
and
Not a full size pineapple. Good. Okay. Yeah.
yeah, no, full size pineapple. I
Yeah.
mean, that
Yeah.
would be quite an interesting
Yeah.
vision,
Yeah.
though. But yeah, so you've got like little nuances like this. You've got also sorts of things like which is there's a language what is like agreed to. It's a bit like a Fight Club rules ultimately.
Yes.
And it's like, so yeah, there's a whole, and ultimately, what when you strip it right back, it's all about psychological safety as fast as possible.
Right.
That's what it really comes down to: is that we all talk in the same language and we all listen in the same way. Um, because a lot of the stuff which happens is because of misfiring. People are talking in ones, people are listening in twos, and it's like, actually, how do we create that consistent language more than
So
anything?
they have a sort of rule set, and then within that set of rules, a kind of effectively a kind of evening's legislation emerges for what's
Yeah,
okay, what
yeah,
isn't okay. Okay,
yes, exactly, yeah.
I
Yeah,
see.
and it'll always come down to still the fact of someone will have to initiate it. That kind of is always there, but due to the signalling what happens beforehand, there's it kind of takes away the risk of embarrassment or misreading signals. So it was a big piece. It was an interesting piece of
And
work. I mean, we
presumably,
looked at,
presumably, ignoring a signal is an absolute no-no that gets you banned from all future. So there are actually tough. There are presumably rules that are highly exclusionary.
yes, but it doesn't take away the choice aspect. Even though there's still rules and there's, alerts and signals, you still ultimately have the choice to kind of go, no, it's not for us. We're here to watch rather than to play.
No,
We're
okay.
here to play. No, so yeah, it's an interesting one.
Don't the
But I
people who
remember I
are
was
here
telling
to
this
play
story.
resent the people who are just sitting around? Well, who knows? Okay.
Who
Yeah, yeah.
knows? I mean, yeah,
One
but
thing, one thing I am sympathetic about, and I've always debated this, is I don't think I could cope with that. But I've always thought that in a world without any, I don't think I'd go into that sort of thing because I couldn't cope with a bloody awful conversation. But I've always thought deep down that naturism, most people would quite enjoy it if you could find a way to make it non-awkward. Okay,
mm,
because if
yeah,
you've generally first of all, we're all short of vitamin D. Okay,
true.
quite severely short of vitamin D. It'll probably improve a little bit with flexible working, but I've always thought that actually, if you could create a non-sexualized version of it, or spaces where it was just completely acceptable and nobody thought it weird, a lot of people would be into it. I'm not sure a lot of people would be into that kind of thing. But I've always thought there are things which, so what, one of the creative things is, it's not always how can we get people to do something. It's also the reverse question, which is what's stopping people doing it.
Yeah,
You know, and I think people have, there are a lot of things people would do if they were less status conscious or if they were less obsessed with projecting their own idea of taste. I've often argued that actually nearly everybody would have a hot tub who could afford one, okay, if it weren't for the constraint of it seeming a bit Hugh Hefner.
yeah,
I think
yeah.
nearly everybody would be a naturist some of the time if it wasn't for the fear of being thought a bit pervy. And so there is a
Mm,
kind of, there is a kind of form of libertarianism, which is, that question of completely harmless and enjoyable behaviors. What's stopping people enjoying them?
yeah. This kind of leads me on to my next question, actually, which is about OnlyFans, of all things. And I'd love to get your
Don't
kind
know
of
it at all. But what I
okay,
understand of OnlyFans, okay, is that it's effectively a form of effectively you perform sexual acts to an audience in exchange for some sort of remuneration. Um,
yes, a lot of it is that
and,
for
and,
sure.
and what was interesting is I've got a friend who I've got a friend, I won't name him on the podcast, but he's really Britain's leading expert in alternative payment mechanisms.
Okay.
And he was the person who made it possible for you to use your credit card on the buses, basically, which is actually an extraordinarily complicated thing because you have to validate a contactless payment on a moving vehicle, blah, 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 blah. Okay. That was, that really took quite a lot of work. Behind the scenes, it's unbelievably complicated what's going on. And so he's a kind of genius in terms of alternative payment mechanisms and forms of identification and things like that. And he wanted to find out how these people actually charged because PayPal doesn't work because you could pay and then cancel. Okay.
Hmm.
Credit card things you can mess with. So how on earth do you pay? And so he explained to his wife in advance what he was doing and went on to one of these sites and said, look, I want to talk about payment. Okay. I don't want you to take your clothes off. I don't want you to do anything salacious. I just want to talk about how you get paid because it was part of his research. And it took them ages to get the hang of this because they thought he was like a payment pervert who wanted to talk about, I love the feeling of whatever it was, or, he was obsessed with contactless. Because you do get that really weird group of men, don't you, who are financial masochists, where they don't want any kind of sexual relationship with the woman. They just want to be financially abused. And you say, you
Mm.
worthless scumbag, the gas bills come in and I want you to pay it. Okay. And they go, yes, mistress. Okay. Right. And so effectively, there's a group of men who absolutely get their rocks off just on being ripped off. They don't want you to do anything kind of indecent other than deprive them of their money and saying, I want this pair of shoes or whatever it might be. Okay. And of course, that must be an incredibly lucrative business if you can target those people. But in this case, they took ages finding out. He took ages getting them to understand. No, no, no. You understand this is an academic inquiry. It has nothing to do with sex or sexuality. I simply want to know how you get paid. And it turned out it was Amazon vouchers because they're effectively.
Okay.
So, in other words, you can buy enough on Amazon that effectively they're as good as cash. Okay.
Ah.
Because there isn't much that you need that you couldn't buy on Amazon. And the great advantage of the Amazon voucher is once it's yours, it's yours. There's no kind of recompense. There's no reversal. And so that was apparent. And I don't know. I've never been on OnlyFans. I imagine it has its own payment mechanism of some shape or form. I don't know. Um,
Yeah.
I'm a bit anti-porn actually. If you want my frank opinion, I'm just as I'm not. Maybe it's because I'm old. But I'm not 100% comfortable with the complete decriminalization of cannabis. I think it has huge medicinal benefits, by the way. And I think it also has huge benefits for recreational use for very many people. But rather like alcohol and gambling, the only thing you have to factor in is not your own pleasure and the enjoyment you derive from cannabis. Okay. I think in the case of medical benefit, it should be absolutely there and available, no questions asked. Okay. But in terms of your own enjoyment of alcohol, what you've got to remember about alcohol is that 95% of people who use it probably are either, we can factor in health and other things and drink driving and other externalities and violence and so on. But probably most people who use alcohol are net beneficiaries of the relationship. As Churchill said, I've got more out of drink than it's got out of me. But there's a 5% of people who are predisposed to be addicts or alcoholics or gambling addicts would be the same, okay? Where I think the effect of widespread availability can be catastrophic. And I'm not totally comfortable. I was driving into the Lincoln Tunnel in New York, and I wind down the window thinking I might have to pay the guy at the kiosk. And there's this massive stench of dope blowing over. It's a horrible smell, by the way. Presumably, if you're a bit of a stoner, you get to like the smell, but I don't. And this horrible
No.
smell wafts over, okay? And I see it's the person driving the car next to me who's doing the smoking. That's not really okay. All right.
No.
And so, you have to factor in the fact that there will be a percentage of people either by age group or by genetics or by temperament who will effectively use this as a substitute for any other kind of enjoyable activity or who will become compulsively addicted to it. And so you have to factor in the fact that it benefits 95% of people has to be set against the fact that it's catastrophic for 5.
So I guess that's where I
So,
was
so
kind of
ask away
going
about
with.
OnlyFans. I can't really give you an expert answer, but
No, but I was wondering it from a behavioral point of view because obviously there's like there's anything, right? There's the consumer of it and then the content producer of it. And
yes.
I think we've seen a big spike in over COVID where people kind of, downturn and stuff, not downturn, but people became jobless and news like this. And it kind of just gets me thinking around what next of this, right? You've got the supply and demand, you've got the easy win, you've got the easy dream and the envy of like how you can be this £1 million person a month and whatever. What does the future look like with that? With that from a
I suppose
behavioural
it was
point of view?
bound to be invented and to explode simply because this is what happens, okay, is that previously what you might call, I won't call them bad behaviors because that's being judgmental, but slightly unusual behaviors of that kind, and I include gambling in that, okay, had a degree of friction around them. If you wanted to gamble, you had to go to a betting shop, you had to go to a casino, okay?
Mm.
There's a degree of sort of locational friction that surrounded the behavior, which probably served to keep it in check. Now, what would be friction, presumably, in OnlyFans would be, first of all, a lot of people who might be happy to get up to that kind of thing for the money wouldn't want a load of people knowing where they lived, okay? They wouldn't be
Mm.
happy doing it face to face, but they would be happy doing it over video. And there are equally a lot of people who wouldn't pay for it if it required them to go somewhere, where they might be seen. So you have complete freedom from kind of opprobrium or judgment, okay? And so
Mm.
we could have predicted that this would be, and indeed, of course, this would be a consequence of the internet in the same way that we could have predicted that extreme online rudeness from particularly from anonymous people, okay, would be actually fairly common. And there's a lovely story about this, which I always love, which is behaviors that suddenly emerge when people are free from what you might call social or societal constraints or norms. Now, in the 18th century, London was, I think, by then the biggest city in the world. It had a population of 1 million. And so it was a city of a size where you could meet someone and never run into them again. Okay. And there were boats that went down the river. Okay. And the tradition immediately started, rather as you'd get kind of, trolls on online media. The tradition immediately started on the Thames that the people on the boats just shouted abuse at the people on the banks. So you'd basically just go wanker, fatso, tosser, etc. And we kind of know this because I think in Boswell's Life of Johnson, it's reported that Dr. Johnson shouted at one of the people on the bank, "Sir, your wife, under the pretence of running a bawdy house, is a receiver of stolen goods." Okay, right? Which is a kind of Johnsonian insult. Okay. And so, one of the things, it's a bit like a school coach trip. Do you remember school coach trips, right? You were basically on the coach. Everybody else was on the ground. Okay. You were unassailable. So, you basically, a friend of mine actually was at Eton and he described an Etonian coach trip as mass patronization because you were all there as a group on the coach. You were 8 feet higher up than anybody else, and, no one was actually going to get onto a coach full of school children and beat them up. And of course, the river was the opportunity for this in London because you weren't going to see these people again. They might not even recognize you. And because you were on a boat, they couldn't come and deck you. Okay.
Yeah.
So an awful lot of good behavior among humans is just a way of avoiding getting decked. Okay. Car driving is interesting in that way because you are in some ways safer to be really rude, like pushing into a queue in a car, because it takes an extreme aspect of road rage to get out of your car and actually trash the other guy's headlamps or something. So we could have predicted that you have this kind of what you might call, shame-free activity, which is highly lucrative for women, possibly highly addictive for men. Doesn't really work in reverse. It's very hard to monetize a penis.
Yeah.
But I'm sure it does work in all kinds of ways, but it doesn't really work in reverse. Okay,
Yeah.
to the same extent. Okay, although I imagine it exists. I mean, everything exists in that
Somewhere.
field, doesn't it?
Somewhere.
If you've got a goat fetish, there's someone somewhere who will share it. Now, I don't know. All I'm saying is I don't know. Okay, we tend to assume that if something's convenient, that it's better. Okay, and I don't think that's a safe assumption. It might even make it less enjoyable. Okay, I mean, it might have been that that area of sort of furtiveness, and the necessity for subterfuge that made some of those activities more enjoyable in the physical world because they were scarce. But I haven't thought much
Okay.
about OnlyFans, but I have thought a lot from the point of view of a non-combatant about online dating, and I don't think it's great. And the reason is that, and I would say the same about online property search. Okay. Now it sounds very strange. Now this is typical, isn't it? If you're 30, you talk about online dating, and if you're 57, you talk about online property hunting. That kind of reflects your demography. But the point I'm making is that if you talk to estate agents, most people come along to an estate agent with a list of criteria. And then after you've shown them a few houses, they end up buying something which meets few, or in some occasions, none, okay, of those criteria. And that's because the process of search is actually recursive. It's by looking that you refine your preferences. And dating, in a sense, should be a bit like that. But the problem is with online property search is you start with things you think you're sure about, okay, which is like number of bedrooms, flat or house, price band, location, okay? And you're never shown anything else that doesn't meet those criteria. Despite the fact that if you had a human estate agent, and you see this in all the TV property programs, they all say, "Ooh, we definitely want a view of the sea," and then they end up buying a place with a view of a valley because it's got a swimming pool, right? And the same thing seems to apply in online dating to me, which is I don't think genuinely, I'm not talking about the fact that once you've met someone, you might then go on to forge a really great partnership. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that you're turning down people or actually rejecting people unseen, okay, on the basis, just as what kind of house do you want to live in? You wouldn't just say, 15,000, 1,500 square feet, 3 bedrooms, garden, parking. Okay. You'd actually have a whole load of sort of non-quantifiable aspects to a house that make it desirable. And I don't think a still photograph of a member of the opposite sex and a few words of description is even remotely adequate in terms of rejecting someone. Okay, because I mean, if you think about it, there are a lot of people. There are a lot of people who are attractive in lots of different ways. I mean, movement, right? Okay, some
Mm.
people have an attractive manner, attractive tone of voice, an attractive voice, sense of humor. There are loads and loads of variables which ultimately make someone attractive, and you're choosing on the basis of sort of two of them.
So yeah.
And now I get the fact people have a type. Okay, there's certain people who have a kind of type, and someone who isn't of that type, they're not interested, and that saves a bit of time. I can get that. Okay, but at the same time, effectively, comfortably rejecting a large number of people. Now, I'll give you an example of this. Okay, in terms of attractiveness, I mean, even the loss of motion must be quite significant. Okay, so let's put it very simply. Cameron Diaz, I'm showing my age here. Cameron Diaz, widely recognized as very attractive actress, wouldn't have made it as a model, right? Because what makes her attractive is not so much just particular facial features, but the way they're deployed. Okay,
Mm. Yeah.
and they're all kinds of characteristics. And so, whereas most people would have a list of kind of wants for a partner, and then would actually end up marrying someone who actually met surprisingly few of them, and then being happily married. I think the same happens in property. I don't think, and because we've taken what should be a recursive search protocol, and we've made it linear. And the actual participant in that decision tree can't see anything wrong with it because the problems are actually invisible. It's the people you reject, okay, which you should have given a second chance to. And so I think there is something fundamentally problematic about that. And there may be something highly problematic about porn. You got to remember when I was a kid, okay, there was basically, my dad was not into porn, so there was no dad porn to find,
Mm.
or at least I never found it, okay. And there was hedge porn. Okay. Do you
Okay.
know what hedge porn was? I don't fully understand it, okay, but occasionally you'd be walking through the countryside and there'd be the kind of sodden remains of a pornographic magazine in a hedge,
Yeah.
which I assume was because a travelling salesman was just about to get home, remember that he had porn, I just threw it out of the window. I've no
Through
idea,
it. Yeah.
unless there was some weird charity, like, funded by a weird billionaire who was, um, but, but the complete availability of this kind of thing isn't necessarily a good thing. And, we tend to go, it's more convenient, it doesn't involve any shame, therefore it has to be okay. And we have a problem, I think, because we have this kind of mentality, which is you now, in a kind of atheistic world, and one which has a lot of kind of where, the young are desperate to kind of lay down absolutely binary rules on everything, okay, regardless of context. Um, I think one thing we can't do anymore is we can't disapprove of things that aren't illegal. Now, let me give you an example of that. Okay, if you were making a program with Russell Brand, and Russell Brand this is years ago. Okay, I'm not making any comment on his actual guilt or anything sub judice, but I'm just saying it seems to be a matter of record that he'd regularly kind of hand out his hotel room number or his
Yeah.
phone number to attractive members of the audience and effectively get the production team to act as procurers for him. Okay. Now, if you're an employer, you can't really fire someone for that because it's not actually illegal and assuming
Mm.
it remains consensual. But in the old days, you go, look, I'm not very keen on this. Okay, I can't really justify it. Let's not book him for the next series because this shit is just an accident waiting to happen. Okay.
Yeah.
And you are free to make what you might call discretionary judgments of, okay, okay, what he's doing is not actually illegal. It isn't grounds for dismissal, but it's kind of a reason not to rehire.
Yeah.
Okay. And, and don't get me wrong, an awful lot of that manifested itself in hideous moralism, in unbelievable sanctimonious hypocrisy from ghastly people. But at the same time, you can't lose that mechanism to entirely where you can say that's legal, but it's not okay, right? You know, and if you had a if you had a member of your workforce, for example, or someone in a team who is just one of those people who's just astonishingly priapic, okay, it's difficult to actually fire them. But if you're being honest about it, this sort of shit blows up one day. Somehow,
Yes.
something goes wrong, and you now. Here's an interesting argument about that, which is it's very similar to my argument against the knee-jerk legalization or decriminalization of cannabis, which is, as I said, there are things also which are very, very enjoyable quite a lot of the time to quite a lot of people, but which are absolutely catastrophic to a small group of people for whatever reason. And I always remember I had a colleague, obviously I won't name her, who was massively into polyamory.
Okay.
And she, basically had a completely open marriage. She had kids, okay? And she was an absolutely fascinating, incredibly intelligent woman, and who did a very high-powered job. And I remember her discussing it with me. I mean, fully clothed in a bar. I was just to make absolutely clear. Okay. I remember her discussing it with me, and I said, my basic view on that is that it's great when it lasts, but when it goes wrong, it's a catastrophe. Okay. Particularly if you have kids. Okay. That there are certain things which are really, really good right up to the point in which they're not. And it brings me absolutely no satisfaction to say that what happened here was that I was kind of right, because there was an unbelievably kind of, how would I say, vituperative divorce. And her children aren't speaking to her because they effectively blame her
Mm.
polyamory for the whole breakdown of things, and goodness knows what else. And so there are conditions where you can say, look, in theory, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, you could argue that this is kind of optimal in some way. And, there are a bunch of people. I mean, I always notice that people who are into that always go on and on and on and on about it as if they don't fully believe it themselves. There's a bit of, the lady does protest too much. Okay.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, there are a lot of things which actually society has an aversion to, not because they're inherently bad, but because they can lead to bad consequences. And I think by trying to, and I think your younger woke generation are a bit too keen on making dogmatic judgments. Everything like that is fine. Everything like that is bad. Okay, and
Yeah.
no moral judgment is possible in any field of any kind. All right. In other words, you have to have a black and white opinion. All behavior is either illegal and should be banned, or it's absolutely fine. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, it'd be nice if things were that simple. I don't think it's a great way, to view it. It's a bit like that with conversation, okay, which is like woke conversation rules make no allowance for things like humor or badinage or banter, where contextually the rules are different. Like there's a tradition, if you're in the military, right, you're unbelievably rude to everybody else because it's kind of a proof of friendship. Okay. And,
Yeah.
okay. Now, I remember I don't know if you've interviewed him, Rob K. Henderson, great guy, who's the creator of the luxury beliefs idea and very interesting evolutionary psychologist. But he said, there was basically kind of racial badinage in the USAF, which he said 5 minutes of mess conversation would have got Yale closed down. The students were, but he said, as I said, the slight difference is the guys in the USF would have died for each other, okay, which I don't think the people at Yale would have done. So if you genuinely believe this person would take a bullet for you, okay, how rude they are to you is, to be honest, a bit of a kind of, academic consideration.
Yeah.
Okay. And so it is interesting. So, this attempt to kind of codify everything, which seems to be a product, I don't know, of our education system or something, that we have to have a kind of codified, legalistic answer to everything, all forms of humor, all forms of kind of conversation. I mean, for example, okay, I'll take an example of this, which is totally daft. The police going round to that guy in Scotland who got his dog to do a kind of Nazi salute. Now, the whole point of that joke, okay, wasn't that, hey, wouldn't it be a laugh if my dog was a Nazi? It wasn't even his dog. It was his girlfriend's dog, right? And the whole joke was his girlfriend absolutely adored the dog, Okay, so he thought to wind up his girlfriend, he'd get the dog to do something kind of absolutely unspeakable, right? And train the dog to do something absolutely awful. So it was a wind. Now, what typically happens in those situations is exactly what happens in an awful lot of videos, which is you don't see the build up, you don't see the aftermath, you see the edited
Mm,
highlights of something, edited such as to create maximum outrage. Whereas actually, if you recontextualize it, you realize that actually this is something totally different. If a really right wing nasty person trained their dog to do that, that would be a bad thing. Although I don't think it deserves police attention in and of itself, right? But
no.
the point was that one of the things that seems to happen is in order to make things black and white, we ignore the wider context within which the incident or the comment occurred. Okay, because by decontextualizing something, it makes it easier for us to be absolutely dogmatic and certain about our response. So, you get that thing of, someone being dragged off a plane by airport security, okay? Well, you see them getting dragged off and you go, that's absolutely appalling. But you don't know what happened to get them dragged off. That's not really
Mm,
that's not really a proper way to judge a situation.
yeah. It's I've got lots and lots of questions, but I want to be mindful of your time. And I've got two, one from Tara and one from myself. But I guess
You can ask me the
I
12
want to get your
question
thought.
12. If I'd been braver,
Yeah.
I made
Yeah.
one mistake, which was um, I first used the internet in 1987. My brother was an academic and an astrophysicist. I was a classicist, and I used to blag mainframe time from his university access, which he had as a astrophysicist, again mathematician. And I used to use the internet when it was just news groups in '87. And I thought back then, this is going to be huge. And then, weirdly, my brother in 1994 was living with a guy who had been Tim Berners Lee's flatmate at CERN. So I got to hear about the web on like day 6, right? Now, with hindsight, what I should have done is just said, I'm going to leave work now and I'm going to start the most bullshit internet business you can imagine. I mean, it could have been, it could have been fucking, I mean, literally in that early stage, you could have launched an internet landscape gardening business and someone would have invested in you, right? Okay. And so, I wouldn't have done that because I would have thought that was stupid. But that was the one thing that would have been different if I'd been braver. I would have said, okay, I'm going to bet the farm on this internet thing, rather than saying I want to become a person in the advertising industry who knows a lot about the internet, which I was at the time.
Mm,
And so,
interesting.
so I had this unbelievable lucky break in that I'd been an internet user before there was a web, which put you in a tiny minority of people, by the way. Basically, it was an academic and military network. It wasn't a consumer network at all. That's not quite true. There was AOL and CompuServe and things like that. And I was also hugely interested in them. I was trying to sort of buy modems in 1993. So I should really have caught the wave. But of course, the wave isn't quite so obvious as it is in retrospect. Okay, so
Yeah, you always win in
there were
hindsight.
still people in 94, 95 going, this is just CB radio, it's a flash in the pan, people will lose interest, it's a novelty. Okay, and so the absolute sort of what was annoying is I did know this is going to be big. I mean, I did, I wasn't one of these people who was hedging. I said this and actually it was probably my behavioral science interest, which basically taught me that the interface through which people do things fundamentally affects the way they behave. Okay, the choice architecture and the interface fundamentally changes behavior in certain respects. And so
Mm,
I realized that people would do things online because a load of people would say, well, it's just mail order with a different interface. Well, that's
yeah.
absolutely true. But on the other hand, there's a huge difference between looking at a catalog, phoning someone up, reading out a 9-digit number, reading out your credit card, and just going add to basket, right?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, so I mean, to some extent, of course, that's exactly what online retail is. I mean, if you look at the Edwardian era, my grandparents, actually specifically my great grandparents in 1910, would get these catalogues from the Army and Navy stores in London and from Harrods or whatever. And they were like 1,000-page hardback catalogues. And you could order, I mean, actually guns, boats, all sorts of stuff. So there was a kind of Edwardian kind of Amazon there, which was the very big London department stores would deliver more or less anything. And of course, in the United States, where you had Montgomery Ward and those absolute mail order giants based in Chicago, were a kind of Amazon of the time. So yeah, in a sense, it wasn't that new. But I mean, fundamentally, of course, the other thing to know about human nature is we're novelty seekers. And if there's a different way of doing things, a lot of people will do it a different way, just for the kind of,
Mm.
well, I mean, I suppose, great book I recommend again to your readers, as well as the previous one, is a book by Andy Clark called The Experience Machine, which is about human perception.
Okay.
And the thesis of that is that most of what we see is actually a prediction. And we use our sensory apparatus, whether it's proprioception or hearing or eyesight, to correct for prediction error. So it's like a TV, if you think about it. The reason JPEGs aren't unwieldy kind of, 57 gigabyte files is because the way you achieve compression in a TV picture or digital image is by only using data to describe the extent to which the next pixel differs from the expected value from the previous one or the surrounding pixels, which saves massively on bandwidth. Okay. And it looks like that's how we use our optic nerve. We don't use it to actually compose a picture. We use it to actually correct those things in the self-generated picture, which we weren't actually right about, which kind of explains why stage magic works.
Mm.
You create an expectation and the person sees the expectation. And if you can manage to be a good enough magician not to actually cause them to revise their expectation, okay, then they see what you want them to see, or rather what they're expecting to see. Okay. And that's that's a very, very interesting theory. It's not entirely, I mean, he acknowledges the fact that earlier people, but what it looks like is that sort of Samsung and Canon and Nikon and all the digital camera people and evolution arrived at the same data architecture through just different start points.
So, I guess the next question I've got now. So, I guess this is where I was going with this final question is, so in my book, Insightful Innovator, I talk about the need of observation in order to make sense of a story. And I try to look, your book, Alchemy, is up there as one of my favorite books. But one of the things which I've been noticing time and time again is what I've observed, I guess, is the vape, the vape wave. Okay. So
Go on.
everyone's on, and I guess I'd love to know what your take is on this. So I guess when I look at vape, I think they've done something very, very clever. They've got the person who wasn't a smoker hooked onto vape, one way or another. I don't know. What's your take?
Well, there are a few questions to ask here, one of which is interesting, okay, which is that if you look at the original work of Richard Doll, okay, where he was the person who first proved, so Richard Doll first proved effectively an absolutely inarguable link between smoking and lung cancer. And the evidence was utterly conclusive. And, this wasn't a case of like, if you smoke, you're 27% more likely to get lung cancer. It's like in the realms of thousands of percent. Okay. It's, you
Right.
get a lot of that kind of Daily Express medical report, which says that, eating, human flesh makes you, 3% more likely to get a rare form of cancer. That's not really a conclusive finding at all. Okay. But this was absolutely slam dunk conclusive. But he also discovered something else, okay, which they never shared, which is that if you quit smoking before the age of 35, your life expectancy basically returns to normal. So it's the cigarettes you do after 35 that basically do the irreversible harm. Now,
Okay.
what's quite interesting is obviously they never publicized that. And I feel slightly awkward publicizing it now. Okay, but it is a matter of public record. You can find it online. Okay. Now, obviously, they don't want to publicize that because a load of 18-year-olds are going to go, Dad, when you go, you should stop smoking, son, it'll kill you. You go, I've actually got another 17 years left. It's you who have to worry, Dad. Okay. And a load of people thinking, I could quit, but actually, I'm 20. I've got 15 years left.
Mm.
Now, the reason I'm sharing that now is partly because I think they should go public with that, because I think what you should now do with smokers is target smokers on their 35th birthday and say, from now on, everyone counts. Because a lot of people don't quit smoking because they foolishly think the damage has already been done. Actually, it pays to quit
Mm.
smoking at any age. Your life expectancy. Actually, my dad's 93 and he smokes. I don't think it'd be good for he's a pipe smoker. I don't think it'd be good for him to quit, actually. Just as actually,
Yeah.
if you're an extreme, my dad's not an extreme alcoholic, he doesn't drink very much, but if you're an extreme alcoholic, going cold turkey when you go into hospital is like a catastrophe. But actually, I'm not sure. So one of the things is that, look, let's be candid about this. Nicotine on its own, independent of the delivery device, which was tar-filled smoke, isn't that bad a
Mhm.
drug. Okay? Right?
Mm.
I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying there aren't ill effects. I'm not saying we won't discover some ill effects. But certainly in terms of the externalities, I don't think there's passive vaping, to be honest. Okay?
Mm.
Not even totally convinced there was actually that much harm done by passive smoking. They kind of doctored the statistics a bit. Okay. But but what I'm saying is people don't crash into a bus queue because they vaped too much. They don't beat up their
Yeah.
partner because they vape too much. You don't go, oh, I won't go into town on Saturday night. All these vapors around, right? I mean, nicotine
Mm.
is, and it has some benefits, by the way. I mean, breathing, it gets
Yeah,
you
it's
out,
prompt.
gets you out of doors. It does ward off certain conditions, certain neurological conditions seem to be protected against for it. And it gives you just a little bit of control over your mood. Which is weird because apparently what you do when you smoke is you instinctively learn that if you smoke in one way, short, intense puffs, it's a stimulant. And if you smoke in another way, long breaths, breathe out slowly, it's a relaxant. So you have this little mood aileron in terms of the way you smoke, which can just give you a little bit of control over your mood. And let's be honest, we use caffeine that way with kind of energy levels, right? Tea we
Yeah.
use like tea is a bit weird because I'm not quite sure whether it's a relaxant or a stimulant because it's got to be kind of both. But now the vaping thing, first of all, it's probably easier to quit vaping than it is to quit smoking. A lot easier. I'd also argue that vaping is a gateway drug out of smoking. Okay,
Mm.
so if smokers change to vaping, it's good news. Then we have the third question: young people who never smoked who are taking up vaping. Now, there is a question there. We say who never smoked, but would they have smoked if vaping had not been invented? That's a bit more of a question, isn't it? Okay. Yes, you could say they never smoked, but they vape. But if vaping hadn't been invented, maybe they would have become smokers. Okay. So it's a slightly asymmetric judgment. And I mean, the solution I'd advance would be, again, a creative solution, which is why don't you just allow disposable vapes to be sold in pubs? Because pubs are very familiar with not selling things to people under 18. Okay. And it would
Yeah.
also support pubs because it would be a new source of footfall and a new source of revenue to pubs, which are often beleaguered because alcohol sales are just going down and down and down. But they're valuable. Pubs are also community centres, right? They're not just pubs. So, I'd look at a creative solution to the problem, which is to say, okay, we don't want people under 18. Once they're 18, I mean, I would argue, look, I'll put it another way, right? Okay. I've got two daughters. They're twins. They're aged 20 something. I should know, 22. Okay. They're aged 22. They're both, one of them's at university, one of them's just left university. They've just been at university for 3 years. One of them's doing a master's. Okay. They've been surrounded with an extraordinarily active drugs culture, okay, where they have access to more or less anything, much of which has been brought in someone's anus or rectum or something. It's not exactly organic or wholesome, right? And a
Yeah.
massive alcohol culture. Okay. So I would say when my daughters were at university, worry number 247 was that they might take up vaping, to be absolutely honest.
Mm.
Okay. There are lots of things to worry about. I'm just saying this doesn't really make the top 10. I mean, I occasionally scandalize people by saying I'd prefer my daughters to take up smoking than take up cycling in London. And everybody goes, you're a horrible person. And I go, no, because if they die at 65, it's a bummer. But if they die at 25, it's a tragedy. Right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that you've got to look at the degree of tragedy, not just the incidence of it. And smoking, by the
Mm.
way, was very bad to a lot of people. Sorry, was bad to a lot of people, but it wasn't utterly catastrophic to all that many. Okay, because
Yeah.
it was a disease. More broadly speaking, it promoted diseases of late middle age or old age, not exclusively, but mostly. Okay, now alcohol can be catastrophic in your 30s, right? It can be
Mm.
catastrophic in your 20s. If you crash your car, it can be catastrophic when you're 17, right? So, I mean, of the people I know my age who are dead, it's basically booze, 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 motorcycle mountaineering. That's basically how it goes.
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we've got to have a slightly more nuanced view on this. I mean, alcohol gets a ridiculously soft ride, largely because
Yeah,
lots of people enjoy drinking, especially people in politics, for example, and a lot of people in healthcare. Most
yeah.
doctors don't smoke. They feel perfectly comfortable patronizing people for having, the odd Havana cigar. But doctors aren't so keen to kind of vilify drinking because most of them drink. I mean, you knew medical students, okay? Most of them drink themselves, and some of them drink a hell of a lot. So
Mm,
what's his name? Professor David Nutt did this point where he made the point that was safer than horse riding, for example. Okay, and
okay.
he argued that if you actually did a kind of cost benefit analysis across the board on drugs, alcohol would come out incredibly badly. All right. I mean, he would probably agree with me that actually, net, even tobacco smoking was less harmful than alcohol at the societal level.
Mm,
Okay, and I'll ask him. I do know him, but I'll ask him. But I mean, vaping. Okay, it's not. I agree with you. You don't want young kids doing it. Do they get addicted, or do they just? Because the thing about young people is they're going to do everything. They try everything. Okay, so some of the statistics are bullshit, right? Okay, they say things like 30% of children between 14 and 17 or something have tried vaping. Yeah, well, of course. I mean, I tried cigar smoking when I was 12, right? Tried is not the thing to research, okay? Because young people try lots of things. I didn't become, as a 12-year-old, I didn't sort of wander around like Winston Churchill, but I just tried a few puffs of a cigar, right? You do. I
yeah,
tried gin when I was 12. I thought it was disgusting. I quite like it now.
yeah.
Um,
Same.
but um, but no. So I think we've got to be a bit more nuanced about this, because one of the things I always find a bit bullshitty is this. Oh, think of the children. So all logic goes out of the window whenever you mention young people. Well, let's be brutal about this, okay? Young people have, they've got the fucking immune system of a horse. Okay, they recover from physical injury absurdly quickly, right? It's old people we should be worrying in
Yeah,
many of these respects. Because the other thing is, when you're young, if you, assuming you don't develop a really ghastly, alcohol dependence or gambling dependence, you can actually put yourself through quite a lot of shit and recover and come out the other end. Okay. I mean, the
mm,
thing you'll probably notice now is hangovers, right? I mean, I stopped drinking to
yes.
any extent when I was kind of in my 20s and 30s. Actually, I didn't really get much of a hangover when I was in my 20s. In my 30s, it ruined the morning. And then in my 40s, it ruined the day. And then in my 50s, it started ruining the whole weekend. And at that point, I go, this isn't worth it anymore. It's not worth feeling shit on Sunday. Just have a good time on
No,
Friday. And so, it's kind of,
no.
I mean, I think, okay, you've always got to be conscious that when people go, oh, it's young people, right? There's a degree of emotional blackmail being deployed,
Yeah,
because it's like, oh, we can't possibly. And there's an awful lot of this bullshit, by the way. I talked about media stories, which are like two stats and a sob story. And as a politician, if you're on Question Time and someone says, I mean, you were having a party in Downing Street, and it was my grandfather's funeral, and we weren't allowed to attend because of COVID. You can't really say, well, I'm sorry, a funeral and a party in a garden from among co-workers are not really commensurable in terms of epidemiological spread, right? Okay, they're not really the same thing. Okay, because someone's come up with a hard luck story, you can't really bat them back, right? So you get these kind of sob story strategies, which are very difficult to counter.
yeah. I find vaping interesting. I'm not really fussed about it either way. I guess for me, though, I like it because I think the smoking is the shared experience what you get from smoking. There's a not
Mm.
tribalism, but there's a community there. And then on top of that, I go actually. There's a second order impact of vaping. Years ago when you used to see these little silver canisters knocking around when
Yeah,
people were doing that. Like I see that a lot now with vape. Like the second order impact is there is the thing of, well, when you've run out your vape, lots of people, there's a behavioural thing of people just dumping them, which
yeah.
is separate.
That's
A
a
separate
problem. But
thing.
I'm sure you could create a recycling vehicle for that. Okay.
Yeah,
I mean, I think,
I think so.
by the way, requiring the disposable vape manufacturer. Now, the advantage of disposables, okay, is you get widespread distribution. And if you want people to quit smoking, the worst thing you can have is that the vape shop closes at 6 o'clock. They're desperate for a nicotine hit, so they go back on the fags. Now, interestingly, there's a lot of, oh God, these flavored vapes, they appeal to kids. But equally, the flavored vapes are a great way of getting you off tobacco. Because if you get really keen
Yeah.
on pineapple, right, and then you smoke a Marlboro Light, it tastes kind of disgusting.
Horrific.
So the
Yeah.
flavors are quite a good way of effectively migrating people off tobacco, so they don't relapse. So I'm a bit mixed on that, because the typical argument is, now the people who most impressed me on this whole question, by the way, because I've been described as the Walter Raleigh of vaping, because I went to the government's behavioural insights team. It was part of the government at the time, and I said, look, there's this new thing which probably is the biggest thing in smoking cessation, in helping people quit, in ever. Okay, right? Now, I said the first thing I believe from a behavioral point of view is it will help people quit, because it actually mimics the behavior, not just the drug. Okay. Patches don't do that. Sprays do to a degree, but patches and, pads and gums and things don't do it.
Mm.
Chewing gum doesn't do it to the same extent of being able to actually inhale and exhale, which is partly, it's partly, I think, kind of placebo effect, because a bit of it's the breathing, I suspect, that
Yeah.
makes it work. Okay. It's kind of yoga for the unhealthy, right? Okay. But I said the second thing I can guess from a behavioral standpoint is that everybody will try and ban this. Okay. Everyone will go, it's
Okay.
absolutely terrible, we're going to try and ban it, which is sure enough what happened, particularly in the European Union. And actually, I know for a fact that, let me get this right, Dominic, oh, crikey, what was his name? But there was a debate at starting a kind of vapors for Brexit movement, because of the threat of banning from the EU. You see, okay,
Okay.
right. So there was actually a kind of vapors for Brexit movement posited, um, which is kind of it's and the people who really impressed me there. Public Health England went and got a load of medical advice and basically said this will help people quit. And they were happy to publish saying I think it was 95% safer or something than smoking.
Yeah.
They were happy to say that. And the other people who really impressed me, which I didn't expect for a second, but it was really impressive, were a group called ASH, Action on Smoking and Health. Now, if you'd been a smoker in the 1980s and early 90s, when you could smoke everywhere, you could smoke at work, you could smoke in the cinema, you could smoke on the bus, you could smoke not quite, you could smoke on the tube platform, not on the tube, right? You could smoke anywhere. And if you're a smoker
Okay.
back then, these people called ASH, Action on Smoking and Health, seemed like complete fanatical nutters, because they basically said, we should ban smoking in pubs. And everybody go, yeah, good luck with that, right? Okay. The one exception I would make, I'm not sure I'd ban smoking in jazz clubs. Okay. Because I think a non-smoking jazz club's kind of wrong.
Yeah.
Not sure about comedy clubs, but a non-smoking jazz club, it's not right. I don't know why. Jazz club's got to be really, really smoky. Okay.
Yeah.
But apart from that, in retrospect, I accept all those bans. And I think ASH were right before their time, but I expected ASH to be absolutely virulent in their opposition to vaping, because I thought they'd taken a really extreme position. And they took the position, they said, no, we're against smoking, not because people enjoy it or because they consume nicotine. We're against it because it kills people. If there's a way of ingesting nicotine which doesn't kill people, we're chill with that. I mean, that wasn't their official announcement, obviously, but it was words to that effect. Okay. I thought it was very impressive, because they were a kind of organization which I thought would be a kind of knee-jerk, ban it, don't think about it. And they were actually quite conciliatory. And, they were actually showed themselves to be actually quite compassionate towards the addicted smoker. Whereas, as a previous smoker, I'd never really seen that. So I take your point. I mean, I take your point that it isn't great. What we'll have to see is, how soon they quit. I mean, to be honest, I don't see a massive preponderance of it. But another, and also, by the way, it does, we should look at the positive externalities. I mean, we've lost lots of tobacconists, news agents. Okay, nobody buys newspapers anymore, so your corner shop, which is often a family business, is majorly under threat. Okay, that'll be significantly rescued by vape sales, and there's the potential to actually sell vapes just in pubs, which would rescue pub going to a degree.
Yeah,
I think you should allow. By the way, I think you should allow vaping in pubs. I don't see the point of, I'm a bit the kind of, I don't quite see the point of banning vaping in all these spaces because, I mean, it's like kind of steam, right? Okay. It's
Yeah,
not actually
and
smoke.
it's nice. It
It,
actually smells
it
nice.
actually doesn't smell that bad. I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm, mm.
yeah. I want to be, and I've got lots and lots of questions over, Rory, and I know I've kept you already longer than what we agreed. Um, but I guess, Rory, for anyone who wants to reach out, follow you, connect with you, where's the best
Oh,
places
Twitter
they
at
can go?
Rory Sutherland, or X, sorry, at Rory Sutherland. I'm LinkedIn. I'm very happy to join in, but I get too many requests and I can't cope with it. But Twitter, I'm fairly assiduous with tweeting interesting stuff several times a day. That's my sort of social medium of choice. But happy to hear from you there. And if you want to DM me, I'll share an email address.
Nice. Rory, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for coming
Likewise, an
on the
absolute
show.
joy. And I know because this is, of course, Zencaster, that I'll have to wait for it to upload. So I'm very happy to do that. I won't close the tab.
Awesome. Thank you, Rory.
All the
Thank you.
best. Thank you very much indeed.